Welcome back to Understanding Obesity. Today's episode is all about the BMI scale. Now, if you're anything like me, your experience with the BMI scale probably went something like this. You looked up your weight and your height, and then you looked up what your healthy BMI would be, just to see a number that you haven't been since probably third grade. And at that point, you throw the entire scale out the window. This is exactly what I did and why I completely ignored the BMI scale until I was about 27, when I finally realized how to use it, and now I use it almost every day as a health coach. Please follow along with me as we talk about all the pros and the cons of the BMI scale so we can decide if it's brilliant or a bunch of bullcrap. So very first, let's start by talking about some of the pros of the BMI scale. Right out the gate, the best thing about the BMI scale is it is dirt cheap and pretty much idiot-proof to take. I just looked this up on Google. You can get a cheap stadiometer and scale combination for somewhere around $270. As far as lab equipment goes, that is about as cheap as you will ever see anything. A DEXA or most of the other body composition machines are going to be in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Along with being cheap and very easy to measure, BMI is also associated with many of the health problems that we're starting to see in America. I'm not going to go in depth on this list, but as you can see, many of the problems that were becoming more and more common in America, like heart disease and type 2 diabetes, chronic back pain, these are all things that are associated with BMI. Now, I know there's someone out there screaming at their computer saying this is only correlation and not causation, so we can't blame weight or BMI for these problems. Yes, this is true. These are only correlations. However, on this list, I've highlighted the risks that have a dose response with the BMI scale. This means that as you gain weight or your BMI goes up, the risks involved with this highlighted list also increases. And as you lose weight, we will see the risk decrease. So though we know that obesity is not the only cause in these risks, it does have a significant role if when you remove it, the risks start to decrease as well. When we take the time to plot the risks associated with obesity on the BMI scale, it usually goes something like this. It will start high, and then it'll go low as we reach into a healthy and overweight BMI, and then slowly start to increase again as you get into the more severe obese BMIs. I got this graph from a study that I'll link below. However, this is a general trend that we'll see. It looks something like this. This is important as we start to talk about the cons of BMI. As we talk about the cons of BMI, they all fall under the same root problem, and that is that the BMI scale doesn't take into account a lot of variables that give us more information. It's only your height and your weight. It doesn't take into account things like body composition, age, sex, ethnicity. There's a lot of issues with it there. So let's start talking about them. First out the gate is body composition. Now, I know this is a really popular one that people like to talk about, but this is honestly, I think, the weakest argument against the BMI scale. And here's the reasons why. Now, obviously, there's always going to be outliers on any measurement. On this slide, I have a picture of Brian Shaw and J.J. Watt. According to the clinical definitions, both of these men are either obese or severely obese based off of their BMI. Now, this being said, they are clearly outliers. It's usually a good rule of thumb that if you have a BMI over 30 and abs, it's probably your job. And if fitness is your job, you are not a good representation of the general population. In a study that I pulled up that I'll link below, men had about a 0.63 correlation and women had about a 0.85 correlation. These are both really high, which means a lot of the changes in body composition will be explained and expected as the BMI scale grows. The last thing to think about is how much this actually matters. We're not going to dive into this too much in this episode. We're going to have a whole episode devoted to being metabolically healthy and obese. However, it's not always so clear if the weight really matters, if it's fat or if it's muscle, and how much that's going to change the overall outcomes. But like I said, that's for another episode later on. Let's move on to BMI and ethnicity. This is, in my opinion, the biggest weakness of the BMI scale. It just doesn't take ethnicity into account, and this will lead to highly skewed outcomes that don't represent what's actually happening in these populations. Sadly, scales like these are often based off of white men. This makes them less reliable for other groups. Here I have a study that highlights this perfectly. In this study, they basically took a group of people and they were trying to see the risks involved in developing either hyperlipidemia or hypertension. And as one would expect, as someone's BMI was increased at baseline, they had a higher risk of developing these health outcomes. However, this isn't the whole story, and this paper does a good job at fleshing out the details between the different ethnic groups. In this graph shows the distribution of the BMI of both Filipino and Hawaiians. it's clear to see that the Filipinos tend to be smaller on average. They have a large proportion of their group in the underweight and the normal BMI categories, whereas the Hawaiian population actually have higher rates of overweight, class 1, and severe obesity in their distribution. This would make you think that the Hawaiians would have a higher chance of developing these risk factors. However, when you take a look at their specific data sets, as in this graph, you can clearly see that the Filipinos actually have higher chances of developing each one of these stages. I've color-coded them so you can compare them a little bit easier. And this shows that BMI and weight isn't everything, and that across different ethnic groups, it really can skew the results, and you need to take everything into consideration. This leads me to discuss how most of the limitations of the BMI scale work. What happens when we take into consideration other things like ethnicity or age or sex is it takes that general pattern that you see in the BMI scale and it can shift it, as in this graph, or it can make it change shape, as in this one. However, the vast majority of the time, the general trend of this graph still remains the same, where it starts high in the underweight category, takes a dip, and then starts to increase in risk as your weight gets higher and higher. This means that we have a simple goal. We're just trying to find that sweet spot where we're not too low and not too high so we can avoid as much risk as possible. To explain how I do this, I'm going to be using one of my clients as a case study. So everyone say hi to Jake. When I asked if he had any weight goals, he didn't really have any specific number in mind, and he said he just wanted to feel better, which is always the best way to go about weight loss anyways. Since we didn't have a goal number in mind, we decided that we would just continue to lose weight until he no longer felt good. With that being said, in the back of our minds, we kind of kept a soft goal of, in the end, trying to get his BMI at least below 30, so he was outside of the obese category. Fast forward about 18 months and 100 pounds, and Jake got down to 185 pounds, or a BMI of roughly 28. However, we did not stop there. Once we got down to a healthier BMI, we started talking, and I found out that Jake didn't feel as good as he used to a couple pounds back. So with that being said, we decided to strategically start regaining weight until Jake felt better. Over the next few months, it was a little bit of trial and error, but after regaining about 15 pounds and then losing some, Jake realized that the weight he felt the very best at was about 190 to 205 pounds. Once we had an ideal weight range that he felt good at, then we started to decide, how do we make sure we're as healthy as possible in this range? The first thing we did was to do some body composition testing, and we found out that Jake had a body composition of about 22%. Because his body fat percentage was a little higher, we decided that we would bounce back and forth between his low 190 and his high 205, doing some bulking and cutting cycles to reduce his body fat percentage below the 20% mark, which is a little bit leaner for an average person. What you should do if you reach a point where you no longer feel better from losing additional weight is take some time to stop and reflect why. If you feel better at a certain weight, then maybe what you should do is just try to get in the best shape you can at that weight. Usually, most people, from my experience, feel really good somewhere between a BMI of about 20 to 30. That's generally ideal for about 95% of people. That's usually where I try to get people, and then from there, we figure out how they can feel as good as possible. Like I said, going back, there is a general risk trend, and we're always just trying to find that sweet spot where we feel the best and have the least amount of health risks at whatever weight we are at. This is how I recommend using the BMI scale. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe below, and join us next time when we discuss what it means to be a metabolically healthy obese individual. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.